Hello, welcome. Thanks for joining me. I think I'm live. I hope you hear me and can see me. It's my usual bane. I'm concerned about these technological issues, but assuming you can. And I see you all there in the chats. Hi there. I'll be going through these later on. Anyway, we have an important topic to discuss today in the guise of a recently released report by the Observatory on Intolerance and Discrimination Against Christians in Europe. And this report came out, I think, last week, and it's pretty eye-opening, not so much to me, but to most people who probably are completely unaware of these topics by design. So we're going to look at this report. This is I have the report in front of me. I read it. I'm going to go through it with you and go through the important points. But more importantly, I'm going to tie it up with the things that the report doesn't talk about, including history, and including the politically incorrect things that the report, of course, won't and can't say, understandably so. So I'm going to start it now, but just as a backdrop, what this report, what's good about it is it actually divides the data that it's compiled into two types. One on anti-Christian hate crimes and social hostility, so literal violence and hostility and threats, in some cases murder. And the other one is the legal restrictions impacting the religious freedom rights of Christians in Europe. And it's basically covering the years 2024, especially for the hate crimes, based on whenever those statistics are available, usually from police sources. And as far as the religious freedom issue, the second set of data, it's covered between 24 and 25. So either way, we're looking at about 1 year. Now, without further ado, here is the report, which I printed out. Again, Intolerance and Discrimination Against Christians in Europe. And it's by the name of the human rights group is the Observatory on Intolerance and Discrimination Against Christians in Europe. And they have a good website, which I actually access now and again. And what they do in another group, which I'll mention as we go along, what's really important about them is they're the only ones who are really citing and sharing with the public distinctly anti-Christian attacks, which the media is not. Okay, if someone does something against, let's say, a Muslim, the media will go out of its way to amplify it exponentially. If it's done 10 times to 10 different Christians, then it's just a regular crime. It's generic. There's no ideological motive behind it. There's no hate, certainly, etc., etc. You know how that goes. All right, so let's go through this report real quick and look at the most important points. Okay, so the methodology and the terminology are very important. It uses the two terms it uses. So, for example, it defines intolerance and discrimination against Christians as what you would know it to be, of course. Intolerance refers to the social dimension, i.e. social hostility and anti-Christian hate crimes, including threats or physical violence against Christians, and vandalism of Christian places of worship. And discrimination, on the other hand, refers to the legal dimension and describes the denial of equal rights in the workplace or through discriminatory laws. And as we go along, you're going to see that it's very interesting. These 2 points, on the one hand is, intolerance is essentially under this umbrella category is violence, hostility, attacks, desecration of churches, attacks on physical Christians themselves, and so forth. The other one, discrimination, this is the legal dimension. So this isn't physical attacks. This is, men and women in suits, men in suits and ties, and women in suits and ties too, I guess, at this point, right? In other words, one is seen as, it's illegal and it's happening beneath the radar. The other kind of attacks on Christians, the discrimination, is actually from the powers that be, legal warfare. So we're going to go through all that. And, it's interesting because this is just about the years I told you, essentially 24 and maybe a little bit of 25. But the report, it says here on page 2, this report, therefore, does not provide an exhaustive overview of all recorded instances. To see all of our over 6,000 documented cases, we encourage you to go to our website. And feel free to do that. The website is intoleranceagainstchristians.eu. All right. So what's good is it starts off by setting the stage. And what it does is it gives you international human rights definitions, the sorts of rights that we are supposedly we, as in everyone, but including Christians, are supposedly have and can exercise. Okay. And it's actually very important to read them to you, or a couple of them, because they're going to show you how outlandish the legal attacks are, because they go completely against what is agreed upon by the European Court of Human Rights. All right. So the European Court of Human Rights in Article 9 says the following, quote, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and in public or private. Keep that in mind, in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. Key point, okay? So you have freedom to exercise and express your religion with others, and in public or private, you can manifest the religion or belief, okay? And as we're going to see, now there's attacks on Christians in private, let alone public. Okay. Another important article from the European Court of Human Rights, article number 10, it says, quote, everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. Sounds good, but absolutely, totally not applicable to Christians in the West, as we're going to see. It's applicable to everyone else. Everyone else, of course, Muslims and whoever, does have this right, but not Christians. And the report continues by saying, quote, according to international human rights law, freedom of religion and expression are closely interrelated, as the manifestation of one's religion has a strong communicative aspect. Both rights guarantee open communication, thus contributing to a culture of free public discourse. In this context, the European Court of Human Rights holds that freedom of expression includes the right to disturb or shock. The introduction of overly broad hate speech legislation, therefore, which criminalizes speech that it deems by others to be alarming or distressing, therefore violates the right to freedom of expression. It's my phone. I hate technology. All right. As you were. So this is, again, keep these in mind. This is what the European Courts of Human Rights say, and all of these are going to come back later, because we're going to look at how, all of this is actually being upheld, except when you come to Christians. None of it is being upheld. All right. Look what it just said. I want to reiterate this part, that in this context, the European Court of Human Rights holds that freedom of expression includes the right to disturb or shock. Right? So much for hate speech. All these new laws about hate speech, which is designed to not give you freedom, are all nonsense, because they already agreed you can shock and surprise people, because it's ultimately about your expressing what you believe and your in freedom of speech. But now when they tell you, nope, you can't talk because someone might get upset, okay, that's the new form of tyranny. That's the real fascism that's being foisted by the so-called left. And I hate that word. If you've been listening to me for a while, you know I hate that word, but we're going to have to use it, to make sense. All right. So moving along, here's another one from the European Court of Human Rights. Article 2. The state shall respect the right of parents to ensure such education and teaching in conformity with their own, the parents' own, religious and philosophical convictions. All right, to be continued. So these are the sorts of laws that supposedly the European human rights have put together, and supposedly they're for everyone. And they were created in formerly Christian lands, Europe. So you would think that if Christians had conceded to these laws, then if anyone's going to be protected, it's the Christians, first and foremost, since they're allowing others to actually say and do whatever they want, which is totally unprecedented in other civilizations. In other civilizations, you can't do this. It's our religion or you get out. So you would think at least the Christians are covered by these sorts of laws, but as we will see, they're not. All right, so now here's the, on page 5, if you print out the report, which as I did, dry throat. You'll see it's got a summary of findings, and I'm going to read to you some of them. So, according to this, the anti-Christian hate crimes and social hostility, the violence, the intolerance, the attacks on churches, on Christians, on cemeteries. In 2024, a total of 2,211 anti-Christian hate crimes were recorded by governments and civil society organizations across Europe, including 274 personal attacks. In other words, the 2,211 anti-Christian attacks or crimes, they're basically, the vast majority of them are attacks on churches and Christian property, Christian cemeteries, breaking crosses. So most of them tend to be just attacks, symbolic attacks, which, by the way, I find even more telling, because a lot of people like to say, who cares? It's a dead building. What does that mean? But we'll get into that. And then 274 personal attacks. In other words, 274 people were attacked because of their Christian faith and beliefs, physically, violently. One was killed, at least. And by the way, let me just be honest with you, as someone who's followed this topic probably a lot longer and more closely than the people who issued this report, and good for them for doing it. I'm not taking anything away from them. I find this report to be very, very hygienic and mild, and erring on the side of caution, as it were. Okay, in other words, they won't give you anything that is not already formally and officially given the stamp of approval. Okay, even though if you look around and you read what's being said and what people are saying, especially locals, the number is a lot bigger in all ways. Okay, but they for legitimacy sake, and that's okay. I'm not attacking them. I get it. But I'm just telling you that, what we got here, this is a very conservative, picture of the situation. It's accurate, but I think it's actually much worse. And I think there's a quote here, which I'll get to, where they even admit that. Okay. All right. So now, I gave you those numbers, the 2,211 anti-Christian attacks. Now, I find this very interesting. I'm reading a quote to you now. The most affected countries in 2024 were France, the United Kingdom, and Germany. Those were the top three in that order. Now, you know what else those three countries have in the same exact order? The highest Muslim population rates. Not that I'm trying to connect anything. I'm just saying it's an interesting curiosity. Okay. So the most affected countries in 2024 were France, number one Muslim population. I think I have it here somewhere. I thought I printed it out. Whatever. Anyway, I did print it out. You can look into it. But so France does have Western Europe's highest Muslim population, and it just so happens to be the number one nation where the attacks we're talking about, attacks on churches, attacks on Christians, threats, attacks on cemeteries and crosses, it's the number one country. The next one is the United Kingdom. And the third one we pointed out was Germany. All three have the highest. If I recall, I think France, and again, the numbers I'm going to give you is what the official numbers are. I think they might even be higher. But apparently in France, it's 9% Muslim population. And the whole of France is 9% Muslim. Okay. And in the UK and in Germany, I think they're both right around between 6.5 and 7%. Okay. Now, keep in mind, when you hear these numbers, you may think that's a small number. Well, what's 6, 7, 8% against, 90 plus percent? But the reality is all these attacks we're talking about are happening in localized regions where all of those 9% are living. So they're the majority. Okay, so if you're talking about the UK or France or Germany or any of these countries, and they have, let's say France, 9%, big, right? That's basically 1 out of every 10, and that's the official number. So I think it's a lot more than that. But fine, for argument's sake, 1 out of every 10 Frenchmen or women is a Muslim. All right, does that mean in our mind it's kind of like, well, how can one threaten and scare 9? Well, the reality is that all of these attacks are happening in the ghettos and the enclaves and the no-go zones and the Muslim bastions, which is where the 9% of France are all located. So these attacks are happening in those cities where where Muslims are maybe 50% or 60% or maybe more or 30%. Okay. It's not happening out in the countryside or in regions where there's no migrants. So it's all localized, it's all concentrated. It's not unlike what happens in America when you look at the crime rates and statistics, etc. They're always in the big cities, right? And it's not happening in some small farm in Iowa. It's always in LA, New York City, Philadelphia, Detroit, etc. Okay, so and there's a reason for that because there's a demographic concentration in those regions. Okay, so it's the same in Europe, and that has to be kept in mind. But I just thought that was amazing as I was reading this, that they actually, because this report doesn't talk about Islam. A couple of times it talks about Islamists, and I'm going to quote it, but it's like 50 pages, and I think one or two times it says the word Islamist. But it definitely tries not to get into who's doing what. And the reason is because it's, who's doing what is not easily discernible. And that makes sense because when you attack a church, when you attack a Christian, when you do whatever, now maybe 8, 9 times out of 10, the culprit is not found. They do their damage, they do their desecration, and then they leave, right? So, but I also think that other times they do know who the culprit is and they do know their identity, and it's precisely because of that they don't share it. Okay, and I think I read something like that, which I'll share with you as well. Okay, so there it is. Those are the top 3 countries that have all the massive hate crimes, but it's not just limited to them. So the crimes that I just mentioned, which is 2,211 anti-Christian hate crimes, the vast majority, UK, France, Germany. And they are the top 3 nations with the highest Muslim population. So I don't know, maybe it's a coincidence. Maybe there's some, dots to connect. We'll get into that. We'll see. Okay. But it's not just there. And that's the whole point. So in Spain, for example, that had one of the most horrific assaults. A 76-year-old monk was stabbed to death. Okay. And it says in an ISIS related attack, and numerous churches that were attacked and burned and so forth. Now this is very important. This report talks about churches, which is important. And okay, so let me just stop and tell you what I kind of hinted at earlier. This report and other reports and most reports, and the truth is that the majority of these attacks and assaults on Christians, it's on inanimate spaces, primarily churches. Okay, it's not on humans. It's churches are attacked, crosses are broken, cemeteries are knocked over, Christian cemeteries, distinctively Christian. Okay, and a lot of people, they've gotten into this mode of thinking, which is like, that's not a big deal. It's not like you're taking a human life. It's just a statue or a building that nobody cares about. So and moreover, so that's and it has nothing to do with religion. It's a bunch of young guys partying and breaking things. So that's how it will be presented. But for me, actually, my response to these people, and they would argue, for example, also that instead of talking about churches, you should talk about attacks on Christians, which I do all the time, of course. But here's the thing. Attacks on churches, on crosses, tearing Bibles, all that sort of symbolic stuff that doesn't hurt anybody, it's not physical, is actually, to me, more indicative and telling, because it really shows the diabolical rage against a harmless object that's not animate. Okay, when you attack a church, it's just some building. Why are you attacking it? Okay, it's your hatred for that and what it represents, meaning Christianity. When you tear up a Bible, when you break a cross, when you behead, as often happens, Catholic or Orthodox statues of saints, mostly Catholic, of course, or icons, and behead them and gouge their eyes and all of that sort of thing, that tells me of just how deep the hatred really runs, as opposed to when, let's say, a Muslim or attacks a Christian. Even though that's the more important story, because we're talking about humans and we're talking about a Christian, maybe he got maimed or killed. And of course I talk about that, and it is important. But the thing is, you have to keep in mind that in those attacks, there's a human element, okay, and that's very important, which means it could be that the Muslim and the Christian, they have beef above and beyond religion. All right. This isn't to say that the religious aspect isn't there. It is, but it gets muddled because no matter what, there's a reason the Muslim attacked that Christian, and you find there's some little backstory, and more often than not, it's not justified. The Muslim in the end attacked him because he is Christian. Okay. What are you doing, man? These things, dude. All right. Before you think I'm like a crazy cat lady, none of this is of my doing, these animals. I just have to I've acquiesced to it. I like animals, but I don't know if you just saw what happened, but I was assaulted by a cat again, and it's right here. Anyway, let's put that aside and go back to my point, which was that it's much more important for me looking at the attacks on inanimate churches and buildings and crosses, because the only justification for that is sheer hatred. If I go and I attack a building, if I go and attack a mosque, burn it, okay, there is absolutely positively no justification for that other than sheer hatred. Okay, but if you find out me and a Muslim man got in a fight and whatever, okay, I'm sure in the background there is the religious element. But why did I fight with that Muslim man and not any of the other million Muslim men? Okay, so there's always a human element involved in violence between Muslims and non-Muslims, which is not to take away the fact that, of course, the ideological imperative does motivate much of the violence. I'm just saying it's so clear cut and dry when it's an attack on an inanimate object. Okay, and that's why I've actually, if you go to my website, if you've ever read me for 2 decades, one of my oldest articles is probably 18 years ago, and it was all about this psychology of attacking churches, and even worse, attacking cemeteries. I mean, this is very, very common in Europe, where think about it. They desecrate dead people. They break the crosses or the icons or the religious statues that stand atop as vigils, the deceased. Okay, I mean, how much hate must you really have to do that, as opposed to getting in a fight and maybe even killing a Christian, which is, of course, as bad as it is, but there's more factors to it. Whereas attacks on these inanimate objects, the only factor that you can imagine is pure hatred for the religion. All right, so that's a quick summary of what's been happening in the guise of violence, or as the report calls it, anti-Christian hate crimes and social hostility. Right, the 2,211, etc., and the countries that we just saw, even though they didn't mention it, happen to be in the same exact order the countries with the highest Muslim populations. Okay, but as we're going to see, that's not it. Many years ago, I used to think, oh, that's it. It was Muslims who were doing this. No, it's not. It's that old alliance that we need to talk about. Hang on. All right. Now, I'm just giving you the summary. So I gave you the summary of the physical hostility and manifestations of it. Now, the second part of the report deals with the legal restrictions. This has nothing to do with Muslims. Okay, this has nothing to do with pagans. Well, kind of, but not vandal types. This is what the guys in the suits and ties are actually doing. Okay, the leaders of Europe, the guys who got your back. So there's a whole section about legal restrictions. We'll get into it. But here's a little quote from the report, which I'll read to you. Quote, all right. This is getting too difficult. Hang on. My trusty glasses. All right. So, quote, between 2024 and 2025, OIDAC Europe, that's the acronym for this report, identified multiple restrictions on religious freedom affecting Christians across Europe. These included bans on public prayer and religious manifestation, prosecutions for expressing religious beliefs, infringements on religious autonomy and parental rights, and limitations on conscientious objection. All of which, if you recall, are actually guaranteed by the European Union of Human Rights in those earlier articles that I read to you. Guaranteed to everyone else but Christians. Okay, the quote continues, as in previous years, several Christians were criminally charged for displaying Bible verses, offering voluntary conversations, or even silently praying in so-called buffer zones around abortion facilities. Others faced prosecution for peacefully expressing their religious beliefs or historic Christian teachings on issues related to sexual ethics. All right. So let's take those are, now I've just gave you a summary of the 2 points that we're going to look at, but now let's take a deeper dive in both aspects. All right. So it gives you a quick definition of what a hate crime is, which I guess is good for all of us to be acquainted with. A hate crime is basically, quote, criminal acts motivated by bias or prejudice against certain groups of people. Okay. So we know that. But man, there's so much in there to unpack, which I'm not going to do now. That's a whole show right there. Because, is bias and prejudice always unwarranted? I mean, those words are horrible. I can't believe I even said that, being biased or prejudiced towards someone. But what they mean is, looking at someone or a group differently than you look at every other group. So is that always a horrible thing, or is there actually room for that among people who have a brain that works? Okay, so, and then it goes on again talking about, so now here's an important point. That number that it gives, 2,211 anti-Christian hate crimes that were committed. It goes on to say this is important, that in fact, that number that I just read to you is actually less than the year before, which kind of sounds good. It sounds like, hey, look, we're making progress. The hate crimes are decreasing. But then you find out it's actually because the police and the authorities in the countries that are the worst countries, like the UK, have not been actually providing the statistics that they used to. And so the number has dropped. So here's the quote. The slight decrease of the total number of 2,444 in 2023. So in 2023, there were 2,444 anti-Christian attacks. In 2024, it's 2,211. So it seems like there's something like 220 less crimes. But it says that it's largely linked to lower figures that are being reported by the UK police, who noted that they have now a new change in their methodology in official reports. Same thing with France. A modest decline in recorded incidents in France also contributed to the overall drop. However, figures from the first half of 2025 showed a renewed increase in incidents in France. So in other words, it seems like the authorities are actually doing something so the numbers are not quite as high, and it's still high in some cases. All right. And here's another thing. Despite the general decrease, personal attacks, so the decrease, this slight decrease I just mentioned, deals with attacks on churches and inanimate objects. Despite that, the attacks on Christian persons still rose, even though they're hiding and dissembling the true number. It rose from 232 in 2023 to 274 in 2024. That's in France. Okay. So, and is there really any surprise here that France and the UK are going to try to finagle these numbers into something they're not? Okay. I mean, we already know this. How many times have you seen in Europe where there's a sex crime, a hate crime, or a church is attacked, a white girl is raped, and they don't show you the face, they don't tell you the name or even show you the face of the culprit. But sometimes they do, and it often happens to be a white guy for some reason. Because that, of course, that helps the narrative, and that's the whole point of this, the trickery of it all. All right. And then there's this there's this part, the whole thing, and the makers of this report have a section called significant underreporting. Their point being that, when I'm going to read it to you, anonymous surveys conducted in 2025 indicate a substantial underreporting of anti-Christian hate crimes, often by nearly 50%. So those who experience aggression, something like 80% of them don't even report it. So if you're a Christian and you are attacked, 80% don't even talk about it, probably because they know either nothing will happen or they might get in trouble. Think about that. That's a situation where it is right now in Europe. It's amazing. So here's a couple of I already spoke a little bit about France and England and the UK and Germany, which are the worst. But here's a few excerpts that are in the report. So the number one most affected country is France, which is also the number one country with the highest Muslim population. I'm sure it's a coincidence. Don't read into that. So now let me read to you the little box called France, highest number of hate crimes. It says, quote, while France's Territorial Intelligence Service reported a modest decrease in anti-Christian hate crimes from 2023 to 2024, the country continues to record the highest number of such incidents in Europe. In the first half of 2025, the trend reversed, with reported cases rising by 13% compared to the previous year. One particularly serious case involved the complete destruction of a church in St. Omer following an arson attack. France also recorded a disproportionately high number of incidents with an Islamist background, including the arrest of a suspect linked to a planned ISIS-inspired terrorist attack on Notre Dame de Paris and the desecration of a cemetery in southern France, where over 50 graves in the church were defaced with slogans such as, quote, submit to Islam. All right. France, man. Where do we begin with France? I've written so many articles. I think I'm going to I'll pull up a couple which you should read if you're really interested in this, because they're long, comprehensive, more articulate than oral me, and they have a lot of links for you to pursue. But so France, okay, I came across articles years ago and reports which document, these were official, well-known news sources, and they said basically 2 churches every hour are attacked and desecrated in France. Every hour. So 24 churches a day. Now multiply that by 365, okay? And you start getting an idea. And they just told you, wow, there's a disproportionately high number of Islamist background guys who are doing it. Look at this, including the arrest of a suspect linked to a planned ISIS-inspired terrorist attack on Notre Dame. Well, what about the original Notre Dame? Remember that one that went up in flames? And we were told before even the flames were out that, oh yeah, it was just an electrical problem. It had nothing to do with arson. If most people knew, as I know, and as I'm sharing with you, and I'm going to try to show you an article that I wrote where I linked this, all the documentation, that churches were burnt, that France was essentially the capital of church fires, most of them intentional arson, not faulty wires. What do you think the truth is behind Notre Dame that burned, this mighty cathedral, which I think was built under King Louis, St. Louis the Ninth, who's featured in one of my books, Defenders of the West, because he was a pious Christian, and it went up in flames. And if you recall, a lot of Muslims living in France made videos gloating and laughing as they watched. Now, none of that, of course, is evidence that a Muslim did it. But when you realize that Muslims did do lots of church arson in France, that you'll get it. So there's an article. Let's see if I can pull it up. I wrote an article, and this is really important, so we have to talk about this. And it dealt with this entire issue, okay, about what was happening in France and the attacks on France and how the media tries to spin it. And okay, here I found it. And it's called, the article is called Media Cover-Up, the Jihad on French Churches. And the article came out sometime after, of course, the burning of Notre Dame. I forget when it was. What was it, 2019? And so here, let me pull it up. Share screen, eh? All right. Okay, I think I found it. All right. Okay, there it is. Let me, I'm going to go to it and scroll and show you. All right, so this is an article I wrote, 2024, Media Cover-Up, the Jihad on French Churches. And I basically talk about how yet another, okay, this is actually another Notre Dame. As you can see here, in the 12th century landmark, in Normandy caught fire. That's the word, right? Caught fire. And of course, it was treated in the media like, oh yeah, just another accident, nothing to see here, move along. But then people started realizing that there was this map. You see this map? Now, this map was issued by another group known as, where are they? I think they're called I have their name here somewhere. Yeah, the Observatory of Christianophobia. It's a French website, which is dedicated to documenting incidents of Christian hate crimes, just like the report I'm reading to you. Now, they issued this map of France, which shows, let me see if I can make it smaller. Yeah. Okay, which shows all the churches that have been attacked. And I think, it gave a year range. You can go look at the article. I give all the facts, okay? And that came out. And a lot of it, if you dig into it, you find it's so-called Islamists and so forth. But Snopes, you ever hear of Snopes? Well, I didn't until I was told about it. It's apparently this organization or website that tries to tell people what's real and what's not. And so they took this map and said, no, this is totally inaccurate. Forget about it. This is Islamophobia. And then it turns out that the reason they said that is because let me move this up. The reason they said that is because the map was outdated. In other words, the map showed only something like, that map you just saw shows attacks from, you can look at it, but something like from maybe 2015 to 2019. And Snopes was talking about it in like 2023. And they were saying, oh, but that's outdated. Well, what you're really saying is that it should be even redder than it is, because since the map came out, there have been even more attacks on churches in France. So what's your point? If you look at it, it's not red enough. It would have been more red with dots if it was actually all the way fast forwarded to the time that Snopes was debunking it. Okay. So anyway, I show you that to just to underscore. We're going through this report. I'm on France right now, and I wanted to give you a little backdrop. But I don't know about you. Tell me in the comments or right here in the chat. What do you think? How did the Notre Dame fire start? Do you believe the official narrative, which was actually being disseminated before the fire was even quenched, which is, it's just an accident? Or do you think it could be that this country, which had already witnessed the torching of countless churches, two attacked every hour, which is to say 48 a day, and a lot of them are by Islamists, but we're going to get into it. A lot of them are not by Islamists or Muslims. They're by pagans, modern day pagans, leftists, as they call themselves. So what do you think? Do you think it was just an accident? Or do you think, maybe it was foul play? Maybe it was part of the continuum that we're seeing and that I'm discussing right here, which is that churches are under constant attack all throughout Europe, especially in France, which happens to be home of the largest Muslim population. All coincidence, just to be clear. All right, hang on. Moving along. All right, the next entry in the report after France is Germany. Here's what it says, quote, anti-Christian hate crimes recorded by police have gone up by 22%, from 277 in 2023 to 337 in 2024, following a 105 increase in the previous year. So it's constantly, every year goes up. Those numbers, however, only include hate crimes with a political motive, thereby overlooking many anti-Christian attacks with other motives. Based on OIDAX Europe's data, which is the people who made this report, Germany has the highest number of arson-related attacks in 2024, with 33 documented cases. Now, this, again, I can vouch for, and maybe I can try to find you the article I wrote, but I do recall that sometime in, after the great, mass Muslim migrant crisis and all these, Muslims who were destitute and poor and in need of a helping hand came and were settled in Germany and also in Austria. It was like every week, hundreds of churches were under attack. And one day I did this deep dive. I'm trying to figure it out, like who's behind it, because they never tell you. And finally, I found out in the regions where these great many of these churches were being attacked and statues beheaded, etc. Those were the regions that had the highest Muslim populations, but nobody was recording that. And I had to go through hurdles to actually finally connect that dots. Surprise, surprise. So that's Germany. Okay. The report continues. In 2025, the German Bishops' Conference issued a statement warning that acts of vandalism in Catholic churches have become increasingly severe. Faced with a series of arson attacks in sanctuaries, excrement in confessionals, and beheaded statues of Christ, church leadership warned of an escalation in recent years during which all taboos have been broken. Let's look at this excrement business for a bit. I've actually written articles about that. So yeah, in Germany, but also in other European nations, the churches there, and the baptismal fonts and etc. A lot of disgusting, depraved stuff happens where one of them, they made the sign of the cross with human feces, okay, outside of a church. And that's very, very common all throughout. Others, they piss and urinate, they urinate, piss. They urinate inside in a baptismal font, whoever they may be. But what I do know is, as a person who studied history, is this is kind of par for the course whenever Muslims and Christians interact historically, including in the medieval era. I recall in my book, Sword and Scimitar, there's sections that show Muslims doing precisely that, smearing feces on churches, urinating on crosses, breaking crosses, etc., etc. So I, for one, think I might know the identity of those who are doing this, especially when we tie it all up together and realize these are regions with large Muslim migrants and whatnot. But yeah, really despicable, depraved stuff is happening. And again, when they do this if someone goes and smears a church with feces, right? It's one thing, okay, a Muslim attacked a Christian, they fought and he killed him. I get it. That's worse. It's a human life. But again, there's always more to it than that. Why that Christian? Why that Muslim? Okay, there's a human element involved. It doesn't justify what happened. And of course, the religious hostility is there. But when it's just something you randomly go up to a harmless building or a statue or a cross or a tombstone and you desecrate it, I mean, that to me really underscores what this is about, okay? Which is a hatred for Christianity. All right, moving along. Man, this is a long report, but we're not going to go through the whole thing. I'm just giving you the highlights. All right. Now here's the kind of incidents. So we're still talking about the violent attacks, not the legal warfare that we're going to get to. And it breaks it down by percentages. So it says that of all the anti-Christian hate, violence, crimes, etc., 50% was vandalism. That's what I'm referring to, which is when you go to an inanimate object, a church, a statue, a monastery, a cemetery, and you just destroy it just for the heck of it. The second thing, so 50% of the attacks were that. And the next one was arson attacks, 15%, which is similar. And most of these arson attacks are launched against churches. Okay. And then the next one was desecration. That's 13%, which is you just all you do is you go and you destroy like a cross or a statue or you smear feces and urine and whatnot. Okay. And then the next one is physical assaults, which was 7.5%. And then theft of religious objects, 5.5%. And then threats, 4%. So that's a sort of that's the expression of it all. Okay. Now, as to motives, now this is very important. Who's doing all this? And don't expect to get an answer. So the report really doesn't give us much of an answer, except the little quote I'm going to give you right now. And I don't blame the report, because the fact is, as I just mentioned, the authorities, those who do know what's going on, don't give a identity. And in fact, oftentimes, if it's just vandalism, I assume 9 times out of 10, nobody knows who did it, because they just vandalize in the night and then they disappear. So that all makes sense. I get it. But the report nonetheless does, and keep in mind, this is a very, this is a conservative report in the small c, in the sense that it doesn't want to transgress and ruffle any feathers. It's kind of politically correct. Okay. Nonetheless, it says, quote, Among the 93 cases documented by OIDAC Europe in which the perpetrator's motives or affiliations could be established, the most common were linked to 1. Radical Islamist ideology. Exonerated. 2. Radical left-wing ideology. Shocker. Well, we're going to get into that one. And those two actually take up the cake. The radical Islamist ideology is more than 1/3. And the leftist, they give them, so out of the 93, 35 is radical left. I'm sorry, is radical Islamist ideology, and 19 is radical left-wing ideology. And then the others are, political random motives, etc., which is kind of vague. Anyway, we know the top two are Muslims and leftists who are behind all this, behind the assault on Christian churches. Okay. Yeah. So here again is a nice, a nice summary that again underscores they're actually quoting another important human rights organization, or not a human rights. I think they're reporting the Organization of the Security of something Europe, OSCE. I don't know. It's an acronym. I'm forgetting what it stands for, but I don't see it now. Anyway, they quote them as saying, given the underreporting by victims and under-recording, it is not possible to present a complete picture of the situation. What makes this issue particularly urgent is how often religion-based hate crimes, meaning anti-Christian hate crimes, are downplayed, underreported, or politically overlooked. Okay? And they note and they emphasize that anti-Christian hate crimes do not take place in a vacuum. And then it underlines also that political discourse and narratives have helped to perpetuate anti-Christian bias and stereotypes, and calls actors to take responsibility. Okay, so what I'm reading to you is basically a quote from another organization that this report is quoting, and who are basically saying, again, the situation is worse than you think because a lot of Christians don't even report this. Either because they know nothing will happen, or because they think they'll be further attacked, or maybe because they think this is what turning the other cheek really means. All right. So now we're almost done with this first part, and you can you can get this reports online. It's a PDF, but it goes through various countries and whatnot. Okay. Now here's an important part that I just alluded to: anti-Christian bias in the media. Okay. The media, which forms our minds and tells us how to think, despite what you think, despite you being against the media, in as much as you follow the media, you are a product of the media. It doesn't matter if it's left or right, because they're the same thing. They work hand in hand, just like the left and right hand work. But so, yeah, that's overly philosophical. Let me actually stick to the report, and then maybe we'll wax philosophical about that. So it says, under its heading, anti-Christian bias in the media, quote, concerns over biased media portrayals of Christians have increased in recent years. While press freedom is essential to democratic societies, repeated negative framing of Christian beliefs, individuals, and initiatives has been linked to rising social hostility. A 2022 global survey found that 61% of respondents believe the media perpetuates faith-based stereotypes about Christians. Recent surveys among Christians in the UK, Poland, and Spain suggest that many view media narratives as a key driver of discrimination and aggression against Christians. Okay, and then it has here this is about Canada, which we'll get into, but I'll just read it to you anyway. So a high-profile case from Canada. I mean, we've been dealing with Europe, but I do plan on getting to Canada and the United States, North America in general. The quote says, a high-profile case from Canada illustrates how unchecked narratives can translate into real-world consequences. You see how mild this sentence is? Okay. Between 2021 and 2024, nearly 120 churches were vandalized or burned in Canada, following widely reported but unverified claims of mass graves at former church-run residential schools. A national investigation later found no human remains after extensive excavation, yet the original narrative remained uncorrected and continued to spread. arson attacks more than doubled, and the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, referred to the destruction as understandable, contributing to a broader climate of impunity. Okay, so that's Canada and what happened, and I'm going to get into a little bit more of that because that's important. That's another microcosm of what's going on. All right, so that's part one, literally. The second one's called part two. So part one, again, was to underscore and highlight the attacks themselves, the violence, the hostility, the things that are grassroots, you can say, happening from people, whether they are Muslims or whether they're so-called leftists, but just violence that is not authorized, but given a wink wink and kind of like ignored because no big deal. It's just you're attacking Christians and churches. So what else? What else is new? They deserve it, obviously. Now we come to part two, which is the legal sort of warfare, which means now we're coming to the serious stuff, the enablers who are behind all this hostility. That is to say, the rulers of Europe, your elected officials. All right. All right. In other words, now we're leaving, Muslim migrants and tattooed nose ring Satanists, and we're coming to the same thing in the guise of suit and tie wearing diplomats and officials and authorities who are actually doing the same thing in their own way. So now I'm going to read to you a lot of what's, you can call lawfare that's been going on that is really mind-boggling when you really think about what we're going to look at here. That this is even happening in Western countries. I often sit back and think of the grandparents, the great-grandparents, the great-great-grandparents of people today could look and hear what's happening in their country. Okay, at what I'm going to read to you right now, which is these legal attacks on Christians. Turning in their graves is putting it way too mildly. All right, so I'm going to read to you a number of anecdotes. Real stories, of course. All right. So this is supposed to be good news, but only after all the bad news. It's titled UK Landmark Ruling Confirms Protection of Traditional Christian Worldview. Yay. So in February 2025, the UK Court of Appeal ruled in favor of Christian teacher Christy Higgs, who was fired in 2019, for sharing her concerns about a government policy on sex education for primary school pupils and for expressing her Christian beliefs about this topic on her private Facebook profile. So she was fired for being a good, wholesome woman who cares about children. Okay? In case you can't read between the lines, that's what we just read. The court found her dismissal to be unlawful religious discrimination. So this is the good part. After she was fired, she went to court, and the court actually agreed with her under the Equality Act, affirming that traditional Christian views, such as opposition to transgender ideology, gender fluidity, I'm embarrassed reading these words. I feel dirty even saying things like transgender ideology or gender fluidity. I feel like I'm an idiot. Honestly, I hate reading words like that. It tears up my soul because it's like I'm participating in I'm legit. If you've seen some of my videos, I feel like when we talk this way, we're legitimizing things that we shouldn't even, see as other than what they are, which is pure diabolism. Anyway, so she got in trouble because, but she was vindicated under the Equality Act, which affirms that traditional Christian views such as opposition to transgender ideology, gender fluidity, and the redefinition of marriage are legally protected beliefs. Well, good for her. So that was a good one. But see, was that really good news? Is it good news, or is it an embarrassment and a pathetic statement on the system that she even had to go through this, that she got in trouble at all, that she was fired? Okay, you see, this is what I always feel concerned about. We always think like, oh, look, the system's working and we triumphed and she was vindicated. Sorry, she should have never been fired in the first place. The system's not working. This is like, what do you call it? At best, a Pyrrhic victory, if that. How about we don't act stupid in the first place and this doesn't have to happen? Let's be normal. All right. Now, here's another one. Finnish Supreme Court hears a Bible tweet case. In October 2025, the Finnish Supreme Court heard the case of Member of Parliament, I'm probably botching her name, okay, Päivi Räsänen, who has faced prosecution since 2019 for alleged hate speech because she tweeted a Bible verse and questioned how the Lutheran Church could reconcile its support for Helsinki pride, Helsinki perversion, homosexuality is what she means, with biblical teaching, which is against homosexuality and perversion. Seems like a fair enough question, right? You guys are the Lutheran Church. You claim you represent the Bible. The Bible says homosexuality and sexual perversion is bad, and we condemn it. Read Romans, what is it, 1, I think, especially graphic about this, or 2. Anyway, and it's a legitimate question, but then what happens to her? So I'll continue. Quote, authorities also investigated a 2004 pamphlet she authored for her church titled, As Man and Woman He Created Them. Ooh, again, there she goes, quoting biblical verses. Man and woman, he created them. How dare she? Which outlines the Christian view of marriage and sexuality. Lutheran Bishop Juana Pohaya was charged for publishing the pamphlet, so someone else got in trouble. Despite 2 unanimous acquittals by lower courts, Päivi, the woman in question who tweeted the Bible verse, now enters her 7th year of legal proceedings, following an appeal by the state prosecutor. Her case underscores the dangers posed by Finland's current legislation, which has enabled the criminal prosecution of peaceful expressions of deeply held religious beliefs, which you will recall when I read the European Union human rights articles, is supposed to be covered and is enshrined, and it is for everyone else who's not a Christian. Okay, if had a parliamentarian who was Muslim quoted a Quran verse, do you think this would have happened to them? Nope, it wouldn't. And then, of course, here's another one. Spain. Oh, remember I did a live stream about our good friend, Catholic priest Father Custodio Ballester, who was going to go to prison for several years because, well, he quoted history. He basically said the same sorts of things that I say about Islam from history, including from Islamic history, which boasts about this sort of stuff all the time, about violence and conquest and subjugation. This man was facing, he was convicted, I think, initially, and then he appealed, and now he's been acquitted. Once again, is this really a victory, or is this an alarm? Yeah, it's a victory. He got out of it, but that this even happened in the first place should just be, I don't know. We'll get into it. The grand point, I suppose. All right, so France, a Christian TV program was fined because they mentioned abortion as a cause of death. Fined. In November 2024, France's media regulator, Arcom, fined CNews 100,000 euros after a Catholic program described abortion as a, quote, cause of death. So I guess it's not a cause of death, abortion. It's just it's just some fun thing that the fetus goes through. So okay, they described abortion as a, quote, cause of death, citing WHO data. Arcom claimed the broadcast violated requirements for honesty and accuracy. The decision has been widely criticized as politically motivated and a threat to freedom of expression and journalistic independence. Okay. In the UK, Christian midwifery. A Christian midwifery student was suspended for expressing conscientious objections to abortions. Sarah Spencer, a Christian midwifery student in Scotland, was suspended from her NHS placement after sharing her conscientious objection to abortion in a private Facebook forum. Although cleared of misconduct, faculty at her university continued to caution her against expressing inappropriate pro-life views, raising concerns about freedom of conscience and speech in academic settings. This is worse than being in a Muslim country. I mean, in a Muslim country, you can talk against abortion because they're officially against it too. But and this is where things get sticky. Hang on. All right. Now here's an interesting one. Individuals prosecuted for praying under buffer zones. So there's this new legislation called buffer zone legislation, and I'll read it to you. As in previous years, several individuals have been targeted and prosecuted for peaceful religious expression, which, as we saw, is guaranteed, including silent prayer in public areas near abortion facilities under so-called buffer zone laws. Although these laws were introduced with the stated aim of protecting women from harassment, they have increasingly been used to silence expressions of faith, which we just saw was supposed to be guaranteed and protected, even when entirely nonverbal. So in other words, these laws are being used against expressions of faith, even when those expressions are nonverbal. They're silent. It's someone just standing there praying. And all of this raises serious concerns about freedom of religion and expression. So here's one example. In the UK, an army veteran, in October of 2024, the conviction of Adam Smith Connor by a British court caused international concern. I wonder why. The army veteran and father was found guilty for silently praying in his mind within a designated buffer zone, 50 meters from an abortion facility. Mr. Smith Connor did not speak to or engage with anyone, yet the court deemed his quiet posture, head slightly bowed and hands clasped, as an expression of disapproval of abortion, their words, which is prohibited in the zone. He has appealed the conviction and is currently awaiting a hearing at the Court of Appeal. Okay? So a man, you remember what I read to you before about, it said public, the manifestation of religious beliefs in private and public are guaranteed. Here's a guy that goes and just stands there quietly with his head bowed praying, and now he's in trouble. All right? Do you think if that was a Muslim doing that on his hands and knees and facing Mecca, and he would be in trouble at all? Just a question. All right. Here's a little more about this buffer zone. Anyway, you're not the whole point of this buffer zone is you're not supposed to. It's such a sacred thing to them, this abortion. Let me read it to you. Despite international outcry following the man I just read about, Adam Smith Connor's conviction, the United Kingdom enacted a nationwide buffer zone law in October 24. Section 9 of the Public Order Act 2023, mirroring similar provisions, Scotland and Ireland, makes it an offense to intentionally or recklessly influence a person's decision to access or facilitate abortion services at an abortion clinic within 150 meters. Violations of this provision are punishable by an unlimited fine. According to official government guidance, offenses extend beyond vocal protests or leaflet distribution and may also include prayer. The government website explicitly lists silent prayer as a violation. Who creates such stringent laws? This tells you that abortion is a sacred, it's a sacrament to these people. Okay, nobody's going to create these kinds of laws where you can't even stand and bow your head and pray, which they, as atheists, can just dismiss as some guy just standing there thinking, and they're banning that. Why? Because that is just how precious abortion is to these people. Okay, think about that. All right, individuals prosecuted in the UK for peaceful religious expressions in buffer zones. So here's a few more. UK. In January 2025, the Crown Court found Christian preacher Stephen Green guilty and ordered him to pay 7,500 euros for silently holding a Bible verse in the proximity of an abortion clinic in London. In February 2025, Isabel Vaughn Spruce was approached by police for standing silently within a buffer zone. Officers told her that her, quote, mere presence was causing people harassment. Okay. Again, this is how you see what's really important. It's not the economy. It's not your rights. It's not your freedoms. It's this. It's making sure that those poor souls that are standing and getting ready to abort their children, nobody messes with them. Nobody in any way, shape, or form gets them to think twice. Okay. We've worked hard for this. We need to, this is what we've been waiting for. All right. So we're not going to have you come here and stand and pray and whatnot. Diabolical stuff, if you only knew. All right. In March 2025, Pastor Clive Johnston stood trial for conducting an open-air Sunday service on the edge of a buffer zone in Coleraine, Northern Ireland. Although abortion was not even mentioned during the service, he was accused of attempting to influence individuals entering the facility and got in trouble. In April 2025, 64-year-old Christian woman Livia Tassisi Bolt was convicted for holding a sign that read, "Here to talk if you want," near an abortion clinic in Bournemouth. In August 2025, Isabel Von Spruce was again investigated by police for the third time for silently praying near a clinic. This is what the police are doing. Remember all the church attacks and the destruction and desecration? Nobody cares about that. Nobody's out to protect that or stand vigilant. But you go and stand the bench next to an abortion clinic and try to pray. Now that's a problem. That's what the government is made to stop. Okay. Scotland has created a buffer zone law which could criminalize prayer in one's own home. In September 2025, 75-year-old Christian grandmother Rose Docherty was arrested and 75 years old woman, was arrested and criminally charged for the second time after holding a sign near a hospital reading, "Coercion is a crime, here to talk, but only if you want." Oh, heaven forbid. What a horrible, horrible message. The incident within 200 meters of the facility marked the first conviction under Scotland's far-reaching buffer zone law. The law extends restrictions to private residences, the report continues. Following its adoption, the Scottish government issued letters to residents within designated zones, warning that, quote, "activities in a private place such as a house may fall under the law if visible or audible from outside." You people understand what's going on? You get it? You understand? Or are you still thinking, oh, these are just laws and, they're just people, it's subjective and whatever. It's not intentional. There's no diabolical agenda here. This is all just, well, let's continue. Happily, I'm almost done with this report. And we're going to zip through some of it. Okay, so here's a section. Criminalization of Christian teaching and counseling. What's this about? So in Finland, an elderly couple was convicted for private prayer. Here we go again. In March 2025. What's up with Finland? I mean, for a small little country, it's got a lot of these, doesn't it? In March 2025, a Finnish court convicted an elderly Christian couple of assault after they prayed with a young man about his struggles with sexuality. The young man had voluntarily sought their support and participated in the prayer. Yet the court upheld his claim that the prayers caused psychological harm. The ruling has raised serious concerns. If non-coercive prayer in a voluntary faith-based setting can constitute assault, spiritual care could become a legal risk. Faith leaders may become hesitant to offer prayer or counsel, even when explicitly asked, if such support can later be reinterpreted as harmful without evidence of coercion. In other words, as I understand it, some man struggling with sexuality, I don't know what that means, homosexuality maybe, he sought prayer from two elderly Christians. They met with him and they had a voluntary prayer, and then later on he decided to complain about it and say their prayer caused him psychological harm. So now they're in trouble, and the whole thing, and nobody may be able to pray or do anything with anyone ever again because of that. Okay, are you starting to see how these are all pretexts? I mean, the sort of things that people get away with, and then every time, one little minor complaint, and it's like, oh yeah, we got to shut everything down. But it's always directed in one certain direction, isn't it? UK religious leaders warn new law could criminalize Christian teaching. In the United Kingdom, a proposed law aiming to ban conversion therapies has sparked fears that it could criminalize prayer, pastoral care, counseling, and even preaching related to sexual ethics. Critics argued that the draft's vague language and lack of definitions, they always are like that, pose a threat to freedom of expression and religion. In an open letter, over 1,000 church leaders warned that the bill could criminalize mainstream historic Christian teaching on marriage and sexual ethics, and potentially make sharing the gospel illegal. Therapists have also expressed concern that treating children with gender dysphoria could be criminalized. In other words, once again, these laws are written in such a vague way that as it says, mainstream historic Christian teaching on things like marriage and sexual ethics might be criminalized. I wouldn't be surprised at all. I mean, they're already mistranslating the Bible when it comes to this sort of thing, if not just outright ignoring its sexual ethic and whatnot. So it's just amazing how this stuff is happening, and few people really get and understand what's going on around them because they're so acclimated. They are the proverbial boiling frog. I have a good video about that coming out soon. Stay tuned. Here's another one for you. We're almost done. Spain, Catholic diocese investigated under trans equality law. In January 2025, the Spanish Ministry of Equality launched an investigation against 7 Catholic dioceses over alleged breaches of the 2023 trans equality law when offering pastoral care, following a complaint by the Spanish Association Against Convergence Therapies. As the law contains very vague wording, here we go again, criminalizing action, quote, aimed at modifying the sexual orientation or gender identity or expression of individuals, even with their consent, could be misused to prosecute individuals who offer pastoral care around issues of sexual immorality. In other words, they're doing everything possible to make sure that their entire indoctrination of people and turning them into whatever, from homosexuals to trans creatures to whatever, nobody challenges them. Nobody can get in the way. Okay, so it's a myth when they tell you, oh, they have the right to live that way, and you have the right to, live your way and share it. No, that's a lie. You can't interfere. This is sacred to them, what they're doing. This disgusting social engineering process that's unfolding before our eyes. And so even though the law is clear and you should be able to do what, these praying silently, to put it mildly, they are not going to stand for that because they've worked too hard to spread the revolution, as it were, this sexual perverse revolution. And they're not going to stop now by having some pesky Christians get in the way and pray and try to exercise their rights. That simply won't do. That's what's really going on if you want to read between the lines. All right, religious symbols and manifestation in the public sphere. Although the public dimension of religious freedom clearly protects the human right to manifest one's religion or belief in public, the idea that religion should be confined to the private sphere continues to lead to restrictions in this area. Well, is this about Muslims? They have to confine, their prayers in private sphere? No, it's talking about Christians. So in Germany, a court bans the crucifix from the Bavarian schools. Excuse me. In August 2025, the Bavarian Administrative Court ordered the removal of crucifixes from state secondary schools, arguing that exposure to the symbol was compulsory, recurring, and unavoidable, and thereby interfered with the negative dimension of freedom of belief, whatever that even means. France, good old France. I have to tell you, the thing about France that really always gets me is the great irony. France is home of the Franks, and the Franks were the chief proponents of the Crusades. When you talk about the Crusades, I mean, there were others. There were the Normans, notably, and, the Germans and other people around Europe. But it was the Franks that actually spearheaded and were most zealous about protecting Christendom against Islam. From Charlemagne and his grandfather, Charles Martel, who stopped the Muslims in 732 at the Battle of Poitiers, all the way down, you have Frankish, King Louis was a Frankish king, and so many others. And it's so amazing that they've gone from being the chief, spearheaders of the crusade to being the absolute exact opposite, where now they are the ones who have the biggest Muslim population. They used to invade Islamic lands and fight them there. Now they're bringing Muslims in. And as I told you, 2 churches every hour being destroyed in France. Quite the irony, quite the shift, don't you think? I always think about that when I think of France. And, it's known as the eldest, the church's eldest daughter, I think is the phrase, the Catholic Church. So quite ironic. Anyway, in France in December of 2024, an administrative court ruled that the town of Boisquer must remove a nativity scene from its town hall, citing a breach of secularism laws. The mayor refused to comply, prompting additional legal action and threats of escalating fines. Norway, new education law bans preaching in schools. This new Education Act that came into force in August 2024 prohibits proselytizing in schools, including during religion classes. This preaching ban has led to confusion, as no definition of the forbidden action of preaching was provided, intentionally so, because they always want to make it as broad and generic as possible so they can apply it as broadly and generically as possible. In November 2024, public schools in Trondheim received a letter from the municipality stating that attending a church service with pupils was no longer allowed. Many Norwegian schools reacted by canceling Christmas service. Although the education minister later clarified that voluntary services are still permissible, the lack of clarity has created legal insecurity and may deter educators from accommodating religious traditions. And that's the whole point, to create a chill, to make people fear what's going on. And now we come to parental rights in religious education. All right, so I'm reading again. We're almost done. International human rights law affirms the right of parents to ensure their children's education aligns with the parents' religious convictions. Okay, so international human right laws affirm that the parent, their children's education should align with the parents' own religious convictions, including the right to establish and access religious schools. However, in several European countries, these rights are being curtailed through discriminatory policies and legal decisions. One of the common themes is that secular education is viewed as neutral as opposed to religious education. But is it? No, secular education is not neutral. It's the antithesis of Christian education. Okay? Because secular education will teach that, it's perfectly okay for two men to marry. Christian theology says, no, it's not. So so secular education is not neutral, and I know they try to do that. It has its own agenda, obviously, which is oftentimes antithetical to Christianity. That word secularism sounds so nice and neutral and objective. It's not. Okay, Spain. Here's an example. Constitutional Court bans a father from reading the Bible to his son. In May 2025, Spain's Constitutional Court rejected the appeal of an evangelical father seeking to share his religious beliefs with his son. The court upheld earlier rulings that prohibited him from taking the child to church or reading the Bible with him, and granted the secular mother exclusive authority over the child's religious upbringing until the age of 12. By prohibiting a parent from accompanying their child to church or engaging in religious education at home, the court's decision raises serious concerns about the right to ensure the religious and moral education of one's child in accordance with expression of the other. In accordance with one's convictions. Let me read that again. The court's decision raises serious concerns about the right to ensure the religious and moral education of one's child in accordance with one's convictions. It also appears to grant one parent the power to veto the religious expression of the other, effectively privileging a secular moral framework over a religious one for the formative years of the child. All by design. Don't ever forget that. In Switzerland, a Catholic girls' school was denied public funding. In January 2025, the Swiss Federal Court of Lausanne ruled against the Catholic girls' school St. Catherine of Will, banning it from receiving public funds. The court argued that being a Catholic school reserved for girls, the school would practice discrimination. Despite the fact that none of the religious activities in the school curriculum are compulsory, 3 of the 5 judges argued that the pupils were nevertheless being strongly guided towards the Catholic faith, which in their view violated the principle of neutrality. I think I'm going to stop there because that's enough of this. It's almost over, and feel free to go through it yourself. Here it is, the intolerance and what is it? Yeah, the Observatory on Intolerance and Discrimination Against Christians in Europe. OIDAC is the acronym. The report, here it is. All right, that's enough of that. Now let's get to the fun stuff. My analysis. So first of all, this is this report deals with what? Deals with Europe. And the issue, of course, is far above and beyond Europe. Europe is just one aspect of it. The issue is in North America as well. So we're going to look at that real quick. All right. Let's talk about Canada. The friendly North, eh? So I think I already read to you about what was happening. I think the number now, it started, I don't remember, maybe you, if you were, I mentioned it in the report said it. Maybe it was like in 2019 or something. And since then it's been going on, where I think just in 1 year, something like 40 churches were torched, and then it's been continued on. The last number I've come across is probably bigger, was 120 churches in little old Canada. Yeah, Canada is big land size, but it's a small country population wise. So 120 churches being torched and attacked, that's a big deal. And I read to you the reason was this: for the longest time they claimed that, oh, we found these burials. Basically, evil Catholic priests were abducting poor native children under the guise of, teaching them and putting them in boarding schools, but they were torturing them and murdering them and burying up the evidence. Yeah, well, it turned out none of it was true. Okay. As I read to you, but I've actually looked into even deeper dives. I just read to you a simple quote, but it's not true. The narrative was a lie, and it's been exposed. That hasn't stopped what's been happening, which is more and more attacks on churches, because it was never about that. That is always the pretext, and that's the point. All those rules I read to you and all these excuses and pretexts about why this, that, or the other thing Christians can't say or do, these are pretexts. Okay, and the hostility, the hatred is innate, and it's just trying to cover itself up, which is what makes the Muslim attack so much more refreshing, in my opinion, because they're much more easy to identify and understand and rationalize. They're straightforward. There's no dissembling. The leftist thing that we're going to get into a little deeper, that's the problem, because it appropriates all this social justice language, none of which it believes, all of which it's happy to violate. And it's only using it to do what it's doing, which is essentially attack and destroy anything that's Christian. That's really it. This is what's going on behind the scenes. And once we move on, so going back to Canada, when those 120 churches were being attacked and burned, and there was a false narrative about natives, young native kids being killed or buried and whatever. Here's what the Canadian authorities were saying. All right. On June 30, 2021, after the first 24 churches were torched, Harsha Walaya, who was then head of British Columbia's Civil Liberties Association, which claims to, quote, promote, defend, sustain, and extend civil liberties and human rights, tweeted, speaking of the churches, quote, burn them all down. So much for her championing the civil liberties and human rights of Canadians, which apparently only apply to certain Canadians and not others. Okay. So based on that false lie, that false rumor, she said, and what, I read to you, 24 churches were already attacked. Her advice, this official, was burn them all down. Why are you stopping now? Prominent lawyer Caitlin Urquhart said the same thing. Literally, she parroted the Indian woman, and she wrote, burn it all down. Heidi Matthews of Harvard Law School described the vandalization and torching of churches as, quote, the right of resistance to extreme and systemic injustice. What are you talking about? Even if there was extreme and systemic injustice, you're talking about events that happened like 150 years ago, and they didn't even happen the way you think they happened. So again, and here's another one. Gerald Butts, who was a close confidant of the then Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, said that the attacks were, quote, understandable. And as for the Prime Minister at the time, Justin Trudeau, after offering the usual lip service and saying that ongoing church attacks are unacceptable, sounded good. He went on to say, but I still understand the anger that's out there against institutions like the Catholic Church. It's real, And it's fully understandable given the shameful history that we're all becoming more and more aware of. Okay. So, think of what he just said. Attacks on Christian churches are unacceptable, but they're also understandable. Well, the two just cancel each other out. If something's understandable, then it's not unacceptable because we get it. Makes sense. So that's basically what he's saying. But again, bear in mind what they're talking about is mythology. The Catholic Church did not do what they are accusing it of doing. I already read to you what happened in Europe, which is a lot of Christians are complaining that the media is set against them. And we know that, of course, even here in the United States, don't we? All you have to do is watch a movie. These are my pet peeves. Is when I watch a historical type movie, and immediately, and whoever's a Christian, the guy with the cross, the clergyman, is often the absolute most despicable character in the entire movie. And the guy who's not, even if he's a nominal Christian, but he's kind of like he has doubts about his faith, and he's the hero. And then, of course, the Muslims and the pagans are, heroized and whatnot. So all of this is always ongoing, nonstop. But what about the United States? Well, I mean, we've seen Europe, we've seen Canada. Surely not the USA is not engaged in this sort of thing. Well, let's see. So I remember reading, I can pull it up to you, but there's a February 2024 report by the Family Research Council, which in its own words was, quote, tracking acts of hostility against churches in the United States. Again, I told you, attacks on churches to me are a very good litmus test as to the sort of hostility any segment of the population has for Christianity itself, more so than attacks on Christian people, because those can be a little more subjective. There may be personal motives involved. So here are some of the numbers it gives. It says, I'm reading the quote now from that report, quote, between January 2018 and November 2023, at least 915 acts of hostility occurred against churches in the United States. The types of acts include vandalism, arson, gun-related incidents, bomb threats, and more. In 2023, Family Research Council identified 436 incidents, more than double the number identified in 2022, and more than 8 times the number identified in 2018. These findings suggest that hostility against U.S. churches is not only on the rise, but also accelerating. Now, look at some of the examples of the actors who are engaged behind attacks on churches in America. One of them was a person named Cameron David Storer. And this was a man who claimed to be a woman, and he burned down a 117-year-old church building in response to, quote, this is what the report says, voices in her head. And the day after, the Kentucky House of Representatives passed a bill that would protect children from sexual mutilation, also known as gender transitioning. Vandals sprayed painted trans power on St. Joseph Catholic Church in Louisville. So I'm reading to you one excerpt. The report continues. After pointing out that hostility against churches in the United States is widespread and growing, one of the report's editors adds that they point to a larger spiritual battle and a growing climate of hostility towards Christianity. The motivations for some of these acts of vandalism, arson, gun-related incidents, bomb threats, or other acts appear political, while many more seem completely inexplicable. Yet all of these incidents represent a deeply concerning trend. Yeah, I would think so. So let's make sense of it all. What is all? Okay, I am now done reading reports and whatnot. Well, I'm just trying to get my thoughts together. And now I'm going to synthesize it all and try to give you a meaningful interpretation of what's really going on. And we must begin with history. Surely you knew I was going to go there. Now, and I'm going to read to you a biblical verse, which I think explains everything. In fact, I think I use this biblical verse as the epigram for one of my books, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. And that verse is, quote, what was will be, what was done, what was will be, what was done before will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. So spoke the teacher of Ecclesiastes, and truer words have seldom been spoken. Because actually, what we're seeing and what I just read to you is part of a continuum that never really went away. There were times when it got a lot weaker, but now it's coming back in full range. And the continuity that is evident between what's happening today and what happened in the past, which most people are unaware of, but for those with eyes and ears to see and hear with, is actually quite staggering. And now I'm going to get into that, because what's really going on is it's all the same actors, it's all the same players. It's changed. One of them is very, very obvious, and he hasn't changed. It's the Muslim. So we're going to look at the historical Muslim animus for Christians and their churches. But the other one that's changed in guise, but not just the guise has changed, their appearance superficially, but it's the same spirit, is the pagan spirit of pre-Christian Europe. Okay. Which was it was just like the Muslims, was equally as violent against Christianity in really horrific ways, and we're going to get into it. The left, so these people. So when we were talking about the attacks on churches in Europe, and we already saw that the vast majority of them are happening in those countries which just so happen to have the largest Muslim populations: France, UK, and Germany, right? So, that speaks for itself. But the fact is, and I wasn't aware of this many years ago, but a lot of these church attacks actually are not by Muslims. They are by so-called leftists. Okay. And, how you define that word is, it's a very broad, generic word. A lot of them are self-identified Satanists, okay, who hate churches, and so forth. So, yeah, so my point is, and the pagans of the past, that's really what they were. I mean, they get so romanticized, and I'll try to get into that in movies, the Vikings and all these pagans. And I like it too. I love history. I'm into all of it. But they really are romanticized when they talk about these groups of pagan people. And there's a reason for that, because they are the forerunners of today's pagans, also known as the left. So, of course, they present them in positive, glowing terms, because they hated Christianity just as today's left hates Christianity. So there's a reason that they present them as duplicates. Have you ever watched these historical movies? Again, I told you, the Christians are always the pathetic losers, and just they're the hypocrites, and there's no saving grace whatsoever to them. And then the Vikings, yeah, they're cool, man, and they're just like us, and they just want to have a good time, and they don't want to judge anyone about religion. They just want to drink and brawl and sleep around. Well, yeah, there's a reason they present them like that, because they're basically projecting the left onto history. And while a lot of that is not applicable, one part is, which is the hatred for Christianity. Okay, so we're going to look into that. But suffice it to say that much of what we're seeing, and I did a recent video, I think, about it, about the Dark Age of Europe, is actually reminiscent of what happened during the Dark Age of Europe. And I know there's different definitions for Dark Age, whether it's the Germanic sack of Rome in the 5th century or not, but I tend to go with the parenthesis, which is basically that it really got bad once the Islamic conquests that I referred to earlier took over and completely severed Europe from the Mediterranean. Okay. Now, at that time, if you're in a college course, and I even remember my own, they would talk about how around the year 800, attacks on Christian Europe, on the Frankish Empire, which was once, the defender of Christendom, even though now it's the attacker of Christendom. But attacks on them came from three main directions. The first was the most lethal, if you really understand it, was from the south. That was the Islamic aggression and expansion. They had already taken Spain, and they could easily come, and they did come across the Pyrenees Mountains, but also the Vikings. This is the heyday of the Viking assaults on Christian Europe, right around 800. And also in the east, you had these Magyar type tribes and Avars and whatnot, all of pagans who were coming in and devastating. And all of them, again, one is Muslim, two are not. And they all shared the same animus for Christian Europe. They all destroyed churches. They all plundered and destroyed. And the idea, my point is, it's easy to say, okay, well, it's two groups fighting each other or whatever, everyone for himself. But the ideological hatred for Christianity was evident even among the Vikings. It comes out. You know, the one thing that the movies and the shows actually does capture, if you recall, maybe Vikings, the I don't know, was it on HBO, where they show how they come and they destroyed crosses and kill monks and all that sort of thing. Yeah, that was all real, and it was again ideologically driven because they were seen as a threat to their gods, their demons, essentially. Okay, so that's the past. That's what happened, and just to if you've heard me before, I think you understand the Islam part. But just to be quick about it, so Islam, if we're talking today about Muslims attacking and invading and destroying, or Muslims being actually welcomed into Europe and then destroying churches and attacking churches and smearing feces and urinating and decapitating statues and burning whatever. Okay, all that was a constant all throughout history. The only difference was it wasn't because Christians brought them in and said, "Hey, go do it." It was because they would attack, conquer, and invade a Christian territory, and then they would do that. Okay, so that is a complete constant that went on century after century from the start of the Islamic conquest, soon after Muhammad dies in 632, and all of Christendom, the majority of the Christian world is now conquered, which includes the Middle East and North Africa, which is the older, richer, more important at the time Christian world, until little old Western Europe is left on its own, the final bastion of Christendom. And if you look at the sources, and if you want documentation, you can look at my book, Sword and Scimitar. I think the first 3 chapters really get into the what noob, yeah, noob. The first 2-3 chapters of Sword and Scimitar will give you documentation of what happened to Christians and their churches. Okay, the mass assault under Islam. So that's okay. So that's Islam, and that goes on, and I'm not going to get into the whole history, and then you got the Seljuks and the Ottomans and the Crusades before it, and the Barbary assaults, and okay. So hostility for Christianity it's in the DNA of Islam. Okay, the Quran itself thunders about how cursed and you are an infidel, which is the worst classification in Islam, meaning you should be killed or forced to convert, because those who say that Christ is the Son of God. Okay, so it's clear as day that in many ways Islam was set up in contradistinction to Christianity. Okay, and that showed itself in its history. Of course, you won't find that out reading regular history books or watching TV, because there's a reason. Okay, but now the other one is the pagan assault, which very few people understand. What the non-Christian pagans of Europe during the Christian era, the Christianization of Europe, let's say in the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. Don't forget the Scandinavians, and especially the people of the Baltic regions, were Christianized very late in history. Slavs too. I think Russia becomes Christian in the year right around the late 900s, right around the year 1000. So you had a lot of pagans running around in Europe. And so here's an interesting thing, and I actually printed this out. I'm glad I did. But whenever I talk about it, I'm sure you've heard of this argument. Oh, the Christians, well, what they did, they attacked the pagans first, and they forced them. Charlemagne forced the non-Christian Saxons to become Christians by the sword. And how horrible. And the Teutonic Knights, because I just wrote a book about the military orders, one of them being the Teutonic Knights, how they went into the north and attacked the pagans of the Baltic region and forcibly Christianized them. And what did the pagans want? Well, I know what they want. I've watched Hollywood, and all they wanted to do is just be happy-go-lucky like us people. They didn't want to judge. They just wanted to hang out and be normal people. It was just these crazy Christians that came and forcibly put the sword to their throat and said, "You must become Christian." All right. I hope you know what I'm talking about, lest I sound like a lunatic, but I actually compiled a very quick list to just give you a sort of example that completely debunks what I just told you, which is the mainstream representation of this entire phenomenon. All right. So let's talk about the Baltic Crusades. The one I just mentioned, which is the Teutonic Knights. and they go up there, I think, in the late 1100s, 1200s, and these come under a lot of attacks. People always question me, how do you justify that? Well, the Crusaders, they went and fought Muslims in the Holy Land, but why'd they go up and attack innocent pagans that did nothing to them? Oh, it was to force them to become Christians, wasn't it? All right, look at this quick list that I just compiled, and it's atrocities committed by the Baltic pagans. These are events that happened before the arrival of any Crusaders, okay? And in fact, were the reason that Crusades were launched. So it wasn't because, peaceful pagans living in the north and, evil Catholic Church, I got to go and force you to become Christians. No, here's what happened to provoke the crusade to go up into the Baltic regions. Examples: sacrifice of 300 Christian knights and clergy Prussians. Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to go through them real quick. Torture-based executions of missionaries. This is a recurring theme. Flaying, mutilating, and slowly burning missionaries. Just Christians who went to missionize. They didn't put a sword to anyone's throat. You can see the same anger, huh? Just like today, you have these guys, the left, the suit-wearing official powers that be, saying you can't pray, let her do her abortion. Well, here you have people, just because a missionary went there, a monk went among these pagans, and they flayed him and burned him alive. How dare you try to get in the way of our evil lifestyle, right? Massacres of Christian settlers. During the Great Prussian Uprising, pagans forces targeted Christian villages. Entire German Christian villages annihilated. Prussians systematically killed every Christian male, enslaved women and children, burned their churches. Widespread decapitations and body desecration. Sounds pretty Islamic, doesn't it? See, that's the thing that a lot of people don't like to hear. But if you really look at the modus operandi of, let's say, Vikings and pagan peoples, it's not unlike the Muslims. I know that might offend a lot of people because, the Vikings are cool. But I'm talking about the pagan Vikings. I like the Christianized Vikings. They're very impressive. But the paganized Vikings, yeah, their stories are interesting and all that, but they're actually closer to the Muslims. In fact, they do a lot of deception. They relish in deception, actually. Or have you ever thought about this? What is the Viking conception of heaven and Valhalla, and how do you go there? So you're a Viking and you get slain on the field of battle. How are you ushered and translated into heaven? Well, the Valkyries, the shield maidens, come from the heavens and escort you. Well, doesn't that kind of remind you of the Islamic version of martyrs? If you're a Muslim and you get martyred in the field of battle, there's all kinds of testimonies that Ain al-Hur, the Huris, the supernatural women, are the dying Muslim sees them and they come down and bring him up to heaven. So there is a lot of parallels that people don't know about and probably don't want to hear. And it has to do with the fact that whether you're Islamic or pagan, there's actually a lot of shared characteristics because they're not Christian. Okay, and again, you're not going to get this from Hollywood, but you're going to get it from a deep reading of the sources. You're going to find a surprise, and again, that explains why we see the same continuity between today's Muslims and the left, right? Because they have a lot more in common with each other than they do with Christian ethos and ethics. Now, here's one: cannibalism. There's chronicled cases where Baltic pagans ate the hearts and livers of Christians to gain their bravery. Mass burnings of churches and monasteries. When pagans rose, they often destroyed Christian infrastructure, killed monastic communities, etc. Destruction of Christian converts and apostates, stoning and execution of Christianized locals, ritual burning of families and captives, large-scale slave raids on Christian regions, etc., etc. Okay, this is what the innocent pagans of the Baltic region were doing until the evil Crusaders went up there to force them to become Christian. Okay, there's a lot more torture and murder of early missionaries. There's one in 1009, Saint Bruno beheaded by pagan Lithuanians. missionaries in Livonia, killed, priests burned alive, converts, Christians sacrificed, their heart pulled out, all before the Crusades in the north. Okay, mass killings of Christian converts, churches and settlements constantly destroyed that were adjacent to these pagan lands, nonstop raids against Christian towns in Northern Europe. Okay, sacrificing Christian children to their pagan gods, throat slitting, burning alive, hanging in sacred groves, slave raids, murder of bishops, etc., etc. My point is, you will never be told that if you follow Hollywood movies, because as we know, as I just told you, the pagans are the good guys. They're like us. They're not dogmatic like these crazy Christians. They just want to hang out and be cool, make love and drink their mead and ale, and just, yeah, they're cool, right? And until these evil Christians went and forced their dogmatic way, well, the truth is quite the opposite. They were savages and barbarians who were engaged in unprovoked violence against the Christians around them, and the Christians finally did what modern day Christians cannot, which is they said enough's enough, and they went and put a stop to it through force. Okay. So, which actually, by the way, here's one of my little tangents, which I'll just mention real quick, and it has to do with movies, and what I already kind of alluded to, which is that in every movie you watch, the Christians are pathetic, despicable, wimpy. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. Go find a historic movie that deals with Christianity in the Dark Ages or the medieval era, especially if those Christians are set against Muslims or pagans or whatever. You're going to find that the Christian characters, by which I mean the guys who hold the cross, who are clearly talking about God, are the most pathetic, disgusting characters of all. And the pagans are just like us. Yeah, they're cool, open-minded. They just want to live and let live, etc., etc. All of which is a lie, as I just showed you. But a curious observation occurs to me, which I've always wondered. If you watch these movies, like I said, they present the Christians as wimps, and the Vikings and the pagans are strong and manly, and we're driven by Odin and whatnot. So here's my question: so how did the Christians beat them? If they were such wimps, and the other thing they also show you in movies is that Christians are, if you watch these movies, they always act like the Christians, whoever's religious, it's all lip service. They're just like us. Nobody believed in anything. They just all, for some reason, had agreed that we all have to act like we believe. Okay. But no one really did. Okay. Which again flies in the face of the facts. But so if the Vikings and the pagans and the non-Christians were so tough, why did they end up converting? If Christianity is this weak, pathetic religion of weeping people, and the way Edward Gibbon partially correctly stated it, why on the one hand did those Christians, the European Christians, beat the pagans, whether they're in the Baltics, whether they were the Vikings who were Christianized between the 9th and 11th centuries? We never see that. Well, could it be because those Christians were actually tougher? Could it be that those Christians weren't doormats and they actually believed that they could be Christians but also fight back against unprovoked violence and evil, and they were superior to the ones that are now presented as the really strong, tough guys? Anyway, that's a little tangent for you, but I'm going to wrap it up now. So past and present, whether we're talking about pagans and Vikings and Muslim jihadists, or whether we're talking about pagans and leftists and Muslim jihadists in the now, yeah, I hope you see the continuity. Not much has changed. And the overriding principle of it all is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Okay? Leftists, Vikings, pagans, LGBT people, they have nothing in common with Muslims, except they both hate Christians. Okay, that's the real enemy. That's the true enemy. And this is why you are now seeing them working hand in hand, even because the enemy of my enemy, the real enemy, okay, or the enemy of my real enemy is my friend. Okay, and that's it. That explains this weird leftist Islamic alliance that we see, because it's existed in the past and it exists in the present. Most people don't realize that so many of these Viking attacks on Christian settlements and the slave raids, was specifically to take white slaves from England, Ireland, France, wherever, and sell them to the Abbasid Muslims as slaves because they paid top dollar for them. All right. That was all that. In fact, let me read you a couple of quotes here. M.A. Khan, this is a historian of Indian origin, and I think he's a former Muslim. He writes, quote, "It's impossible to disconnect Islam from the Viking slave trade because the supply was absolutely meant for meeting the Islamic world's unceasing demand for the prized white slaves and for white sex slaves." Emmett Scott, another historian, goes so far as to argue that, quote, "It was the Caliphate's demand for European slaves that called forth the Viking phenomena in the first place." In other words, it was the Caliphate's overweening demand that we need white slaves that gave rise to the Vikings, which were these heathens in the north. They found, hey, here's a great economic opportunity. All we have to do is just raid as many as we can for all these other whites, Christians, and go sell them to the Caliphate. Okay, so that was that there was the earlier alliance. And now the descendants of the West's pagan past, who we collectively call the left, what have they done? They've invited millions of Muslims into Europe. And those Muslims, like the pagan leftists, are attacking and destroying churches as they did before. Hence the continuity. And it's not just that. I mean, I just told you about Vikings literally taking fellow white people and selling them because they're Christians, selling them to Christians. And here, don't we have something similar when you look at the UK and you see all these grooming gangs, and yet UK authorities look the other way and don't talk about it, as all these young girls are raped and groomed and whatever, and it's not something we talk about? Isn't it the same thing? Isn't this part of the continuity? Let alone the church attacks that we've been seeing that we just saw in this this report, and how they keep every year getting worse and worse. And so, and then the final point, of course, the only difference in all this is that the Muslims are still recognizable. So the continuity in the Muslim assaults against Christian civilization are refreshing, as I earlier pointed out, because of the continuity. They haven't changed, and there's no subterfuge involved. In the past, it was Muslims screaming Allahu Akbar, burning churches and destroying and raping and pillaging and enslaving. And today, it's Muslims screaming Allahu Akbar and burning. How many times have you seen Muslims in Europe barge into a church and start screaming Allahu Akbar, okay, and scaring little old ladies trying to light a candle? How often does that happen? Let alone the terrorist attacks that unleash all the time, okay? The difference, though, is on the one hand, while that's good because it's recognizable, it's the other side, the left, that's not so easily recognizable because they're using language of social justice, and they've gotten everyone fooled to their true origin. They are the descendants of the original pagans who hated Christianity. It's the same sort of thing, the same logic, okay, but it's now under a different guise, and that's what makes it more dangerous. It's not the Muslims, like I said, what's good about them is you get what you see. All right, but it's much more dangerous when you have someone who you think is like you, but he's actually against you, a traitor, essentially. That's what they are. And they use this language of social justice, which sounds good, but guess what? It's not for you. It's for anyone and everyone. Hate speech. Okay, anyone and everyone, Muslims can say and do anything they want, but that's hate speech, and we're going to shut you down. And the last point is, it's just amazing to me that people don't understand this is happening in their own countries. Okay, it's one thing to say Christianity is curtailed, attacked, abused, where Christians are minorities in, let's say, wherever, the Middle East, in Africa, and Asia, let's say. But this is happening in the homeland of Christianity, Europe, the West. Okay, that's how far things have gone. That's how far they've brainwashed people. Okay, in your own lands where you're the majority, where your forefathers and Christian forefathers built the land, they've wormed their way in and convinced you into a posture where you're being attacked in your own homeland. You're losing your own rights, and you're losing everything under the guise of you being a good guy and engaging in non-hate speech and so forth, all of which is a lie. Again, if you understand what's really going on, and if you can tie it to the past, as I just tried to do for you right now. So, the so-called leftists, yeah, we have We have refreshing ones like the Muslims. They're Satanists. There are actual Satanists who go and attack churches in Europe, oftentimes. Okay, but the really, really dangerous ones are the ones who are also leftists, but like I said, they're suit tie wearing and they work in parliament and they're in the media. Okay, they're the same as the Satanists, just less vocal, but they're just like the Justin Trudeau. They're not the ones who are burning the churches, but they're the ones who are saying, "Yeah, I get it, I understand, makes sense." Okay, they're the facilitators. So there's a whole line of the left. They're all pagans, of course. You can call them all Satanists. I hate that word, the left. I think maybe it would be better to call open Satanists and hidden Satanists, which would be 99% of the politicians of the West. Okay, so that's the issue that we're dealing with right now. And well, it's basically time to wake up and understand the reality and clear the fog webs from your eyes and stop believing what they're telling you, which is they're lulling you into complacency as they keep making inroads against you. And when the time comes that that's no longer even needed, then they'll drop the mask. Then they'll be like a Muslim or like a Viking or like a Satanist. And then your goose will be cooked openly, right? All right. That's about it of that. So let's check out some super chats, as it were. Thanks for tolerating my rant. I hope you're all well. It's a Friday. All right. Let's see now. Hey, new member, John's Queen, Joshua May. Okay. Hey, Raymond, ex-Muslim, read the Quran and Hadiths. I can't agree. Becoming Christian. Well, good for you. Glad to hear it. Also loved your books. Thank you. Oh, actually, wait, let me show these things. So here we go. All right, loved my books. Thank you. Coltrane. This interfaith dialogue going on is pure blasphemy, heresy, and sacrilege, or any other word you can throw at it. This Freemason ideology needs to be deleted. None who follow Christ can be Masons. Yeah, I mean, look, the whole point of interfaith dialogue, I've never understood what that means. I have my faith, you have your faith, and that's it. Yeah, we can talk, we can try to get along. I hope we get along. We don't have to kill each other. That's the Christian perspective. But what else are we supposed to talk about? I mean, I don't get it. It's so I think interfaith dialogue is actually just code for, hey, let's water down our faith in as much as we have to accommodate their faith, and so we can all get along. And it's always one group that's watering down their faith to accommodate others, and that is, of course, so-called Christians. So I think that is the whole point of interfaith dialogue, as it were, which is to convince the Christians to stop being so Christian, kind of join us, accommodate us, and stop talking about what you believe, because that just causes problems. Orditix. What are your thoughts on Trump making peace with Mamdani? Do you agree with how the Christians in Dearborn pushed back against Islam? I don't even know what you mean about he made peace. I guess he's not fighting with him. No, this is politics. This is diplomacy. The guy was elected. So knowing Trump, he's just probably trying to work with him in any which way he can. And do you agree with how the Christians in Dearborn pushed back against Islam? If you're talking about a recent development, you will have to tell me more, because I don't really follow what's going on in the world. I'm not part of that, thankfully. I'm happy to say my mind is living in the past with those other people. They're a lot cleaner and more noble. All right. Bond. Yay, finally caught alive. Thanks for continuing the work you've been doing for decades and now even branching out. God bless you and your family. Hey, thanks, Bond. I appreciate that. Yeah, I've been doing this for a long, long time, but apparently making videos has made a difference. All right. Coltrane. We will not unite under a principle of God or believe in interfaith dialogue. Jesus is the way or not all. We never unite under the banner of religious. We unite under Christ and defend the faith. Well, see, here's the thing. What you just said is what every religious faith is going to say, and it's allowed for them to say that. That's the point. So a Muslim, if you tell him, "Hey, you want to do interfaith dialogue with a Christian," he may say, "Yeah, but hey, there's non-negotiables. Allah is one. Tawheed. Muhammad is his final prophet. The Quran is the word of." Okay, and when you do that, as you should, the Muslim should do it if he's true, and the Christian, as you said, should do it. What's there left to talk about? Okay, we're at a complete crossroads. I believe in this, you believe in that. That's the end of it. That's why these interfaith dialogues are just nonsense. And I used to watch and read about Pope Francis and Sheikh Ahmed Al-Tayyib of Al-Azhar in Egypt, who's kind of his counterpart, if you want. And it's just pathetic. We meet and we declare human right principles and we hug and kiss, literally. And then I watched the sheikh speaking in Arabic, and he sounds like ISIS. Okay, and he's not even trying to hide it. So it shows you even the disrespect he had for the Pope. Sandy, hi Raymond. Are you aware of all the pastors who have been murdered in the U.S. this year? Around 15, I believe. One was crucified. Wow. I've heard about some. I didn't hear about the one who was crucified, and I'm not surprised because this information isn't widely available, isn't disseminated. This report that I just read to you, this should be a major thing. This should be all over the news. It's not, right? A couple of human rights groups and Christian organizations are reading it and quoting it. But by and large, the vast majority, no, nobody cares. And here you're telling me of something. It reminds me of, remember the 21 Christians, 20 cops, one Ghanaian, one African who were beheaded. I think the date was February something 2015. Now that's a dramatic story. Okay, 21 Christians who actually were beheaded rather than renounce Christ. They were ordered to renounce Christ and they wouldn't do it. So they got beheaded for their troubles. You'd think that's a story, but apparently, some news reports they did an analysis, and a gorilla, the same day that the video came out, a gorilla in a United States zoo, I think his name is Haramba, was killed. And I'm sorry for the gorilla. Something like a child fell in his enclosure, and they had to kill him. Okay, bad news, but that got something like, I don't remember, 15 times more coverage than 21 humans saying, "No, I will not renounce Christ," having their heads carved off. So when you tell me that pastors are being killed and I didn't hear it, I'm not surprised. Does the dismantling of the armed Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas networks in EU, reported yesterday, indicate a high level of infiltration? The Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, was dismantled by the EU, and therefore you're saying is Hamas or Muslim Brotherhood being infiltrated? Well, if they are being dismantled, or if an armed Muslim Brotherhood group has been dismantled or is being called and being dismantled, yeah, that's a level of infiltration in a good way, actually. The climate change scam driven and Gaia Earth worshipping season of creation is a poignant case in point. Yeah, you're right. This is all paganism. Look, it's funny because here's a funny little reflection. And a lot of medieval Christians get in trouble for this, but they're accused, they didn't, if you talk to a medieval Christian about Islam, they didn't know Islam the way we do. They didn't even call it Islam or Muslim. They were Saracens, and a lot of them thought they were pagans. And the logic was, look, there's one truth, Christianity, everything else is wrong. And what do I care about its details? Okay. Whether they believe in this, that, or the other thing, they don't believe in Christ as king. They're wrong. So most Christians during the crusading era, they had no idea about the details. And this, of course, is brought up now oftentimes to show how backwards and stupid these Christians were, as if the Muslims were any better, because the Muslims were the same. Till the Quran itself gets the Trinity wrong. It thinks the Trinity is God, Jesus, and Mary. Okay. So until today, so even Muslims will do the same thing, which I think is natural human behavior. So I don't blame people who act that way, because it just is a reflection of, hey, I know what the truth is. What do I care about the details of falsehoods? That's the logic. Okay, kind of makes sense. Um, and so to them, everyone was a pagan. We now know Muslims, they have their own little quirk, but the others, the pagans that we were talking about in the north and whatnot, they're all pagans the way they saw them. So you make your comment about climate change scam and Gaia Earth, et cetera, et cetera. Well, yeah, I mean, these are the words we give them, and they have their own little flavor. But from a sort of pre-modern Christian point of view, yeah, it's another pagan. Uh, saying and doing the same sort of pagan things that we've been dealing with for millennia. Okay. All right. Nils Glenn. What's the cat and dog names? That's secretive for security purposes. I can't share. But I've already told everyone. Everyone knows the dog's name. He's the noob. I originally named him Anubis after the jackal god, and then I got too lazy, and Nubis became Newbie, and then before I knew it, I was calling him Noob until I learned that was some sort of gamer trash talk. Um, the cat, actually, I don't even know if it has a name. I just call them by their colors. The white cat, black cat. Uh, your stoicism in light of this evil is admirable. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I do try to be stoic, and I do try to cultivate the principles of stoicism. And I do find stoicism is very uh, applicable to Christianity as well. Um, I think the Christian message is in many ways stoic. Hi, hi, new member. Hi, new member. Glad you're joining. Kevin, off topic. I've heard that Gibbon blames Chris Tiantion, the fall of Rome. I know Gibbon blames maybe. Oh, I see. Okay, Gibbon blames Christianity for the fall of Rome. Yeah, he does. He's, I think, the earliest one who came up with this theory, which is, Rome fell because it started to Christianize after Constantine, and immediately it lost its military ethos, and therefore it was conquered by the Germanic tribes who were not Christian, but did become Christian. But that brings up my point, which I said, which is those Germanic Christians, let's say the Franks, who were Christian, they beat the pagans, the ferocious Vikings, and the Vikings had to assimilate to them. So I think that alone really challenges this particular Gibbonsonian interpretation that Christianity is inherently weak. Certainly, there have been manifestations of very passive forms of Christianity, but I don't really, not when it was under the Roman Empire at the time. I think the Roman Empire was simply decaying in general because it had been around for, at that point, well over 1,000 years. Founded, I think, in 753 BC, Romulus and Remus. So, yeah, I mean, that is a popular and not necessarily wrong interpretation, but as I think about what I'd said earlier, well, in the end, it was Christians who took over the Roman Empire, the Germanic Christians who were Christians and fought for the faith, and they beat the pagans. So we can make that argument as well. It's not that clear cut. Right now, I'm halfway through reading the demonic, disjointed, and incoherent text that is the Quran, which seems to be a natural follow-up to Mein Kampf. Yeah, that might be an insult to Mein Kampf. I only mean that the Quran is really incoherent. The way it's put together, it's hard to even come away with logic and whatnot. Would you debate Dave Smith? I don't know who Dave Smith is. That is the most generic name possible. Are you serious? How could you ask me someone named Dave Smith? That's like saying John Smith. I mean, it's bad enough I don't know real names that are particular. But yeah, I'm open to debating anyone who's worthy of debating. Okay. not just Joe Blow that has nothing to do but want to argue back and forth. And the thing about debating with me, let me be honest with you, the things that I say, they're not controversial. I talk mostly history. Okay, what are you going to debate? When I talk about Islam conquering Christendom, conquering 3/4 of it, okay, being the aggressor, this is all fact. What's there to debate? There's no debate here. Okay, when I point out that Muslims quoted the Quran and the Hadith and Muhammad justifying their violence against non-Muslims, where's the debate? There is no debate. So again, I'm happy to debate if there's actually a topic to debate, but I tend to stick to objective matters, which are really not open to debate until someone shows me, oh, all that stuff that I've been quoting is fake. It never existed. I made it up. Okay, if that's what they want to say, fine, we can do that. But just to debate, well, yeah, first be worthy and actually have something important to debate, something meaningful. Dante. Good day, Mr. Ibrahim. Just extending some praise and appreciation for the work you are doing and a small token. The breadth of your knowledge is astounding. I really should read your books. Yeah, you should. But thanks for the super chat, Dan. I appreciate it. Scarlet Rose. Just started listening to Sword and Scimitar. The level of bloodlust by the Muslims is unreal. Thank you for your work. You must be on chapter 2. Okay, thanks, Scarlett. Jabron. Islam has always used the sword to spread. Today, the sword is leftism. Yeah, I mean, it is and it isn't. It's a hidden sword. Islam is still, like I told you, the good thing about Islam is it's so I don't know, simplistic. It's so straightforward. There's no subterfuge. I mean, there is, of course, there can be, but once it gets a chance, it goes Allahu Akbaring, you know. But the left, as we call it, they're the ones who are, working undercover. They're the ones who are more dangerous. They're the snake in your bosom, the snake in your house, who acts as your friend. They're the ones who are enabling all this. I've said it time and time again. Whatever Muslims are doing in the West is not because they're capable of doing it. Any Western country can say, bye, we don't want you, you're out. Problem solved. Okay, the problem is the left that is in there is bringing them, is empowering them, is shutting down the opposition and any kind of criticism and so forth. Sheikh Yadik, love your books. On my second listen to of Defenders of the West, I put on the Vlad chapter when I need some aggression in the gym. You know what? Speaking of Vlad and the gym, Sabaton made a song about Vlad. I like to think in the back of my head, my book helped contribute to that, but it's not bad. If you're in the gym and you're working out, you might want to listen to it. K. Nachav, would you consider covering what happened to enslaved Christians in the Ottoman Empire? I am Bulgarian, and I don't know if I can truly trust the textbooks regarding what they did to my people. Yeah, you're right. You shouldn't trust them. That's often whitewashed when it comes to those particular topics. I have discussed it at some length. If you're interested and you want to see some documentation, check out Sword and Scimitar, my book, my first one that really deals with history. And I do talk about, I give statistics and numbers, not specifically just of Bulgarians, but I talk about the Balkans and the slave raids that went on. It's not very extensive, but I do believe if you look in the endnotes and the bibliography, I might cite certain other academic sources that may go deeper into these topics. Okay. All right, my friends, I can take these off. And, well, that's that. I hope you learned something. I hope you understand now what's going on. On the one hand, the Islam stuff, that's pretty easy. It's been going on. We all get it. Muslims are being violent. Muslims acting like Muslims. On the other hand, you have this left, which is acting like its predecessor, the pagans. The left is pagan, and pagans hated Christianity just like Muslims hated it. But now they put on a suit and tie and mask, and they use social justice language, all of which sounds good, which is derived from Christianity, and it's all being used exclusively to degrade and destroy Christian civilization, as you saw in that report. That report is one of so many I've seen across the years, by the way, and they're all the same thing. I've given you examples from the United States, from Canada, It's the same thing. There's another website you can go to. It's called I think it's called I talked about it before, the Observation or Observatory of Islamophobia. It's the French site that showed you that map that had all those red dots. It's updates every day, and if you go on it, literally every day, you're going to see like 7, 8, 9 new instances of attacks on churches around the world every day. So any day you go, you might, and the number might be more. I don't know, maybe 10. Okay, and that's not even that's not covering it all. To be sure, rest assured. Okay, there's probably more that we never even hear about. Okay, so this is a real thing. It's going on. It's in its early stages, and the only hope is for people to wake up and understand what's going on. The world they've presented to you is a lie. Okay, the principles and the way they want you to, they put these high standards on you, and you're expected to follow them, but they're not following them. And you follow them because you are from a Christian ethic and you want to do the right thing, and you are willing to accommodate, and you're willing to forgive, and you're willing to give a lending hand. Okay, but you don't realize that they're actually doing all that in a way to exploit and weaken you and empower themselves. And that's really the story, I'd say, of Western civilization for the last, I don't know, 60, 70 years. It's creeping normalization of leftism, which is a creeping normalization of the destruction of Christendom. All right, my friends, I hope you have a happy weekend, a relaxing weekend, and I will see you anon. Keep in mind, next Tuesday, the book comes out. Defenders of the West. Oh, sorry, not Defenders of the West. The Two Swords of Christ. Okay, so if you ordered it on Amazon, you should be getting it, I think, Tuesday, which is the release date. And if you didn't order it, you should. You're going to like it. This, in many ways, is my tome. It's the main one that, if you want to know about the Crusades, this one, I couldn't help but write so much about the Crusades, because even though it's about the military orders, well, they were the backbone of the Crusades. So I couldn't talk about them without talking literally about every crusade which they were involved in. Anyway, it's coming out Tuesday. And yeah, the journey is finally coming to an end, and I'm happy about that. I'm doing some interviews next week as well with Victor Davis Hanson. And I think I'm doing another one with Steve Bannon again, all of which will be on the book. So stay tuned. Thanks for joining me. Take care. Farewell. Bye.